Thank you so much, Ilse Marie. I'm actually going to share a presentation with you because in my day job as a political analyst, I speak on a daily basis to the financial sector and to investors, both domestically and internationally. And I've been getting for the last year, 2 years, most probably, the same questions consistently. And that's been, is the GNU working? Will it last? What happens to Cyril Ramaphosa? Is he going? Is he staying? What happens then? And then, of course, in the last few months, I've been getting questions around the geopolitical issues. So I'm going to focus on these issues, but I'm going to do it with a presentation because I think that always helps to be able to look at something and not just me all the time. So let's do this. So there we go. Look, if you want to understand the GNU, it's quite important to just, for a very brief moment, look back at what happened last year with the elections. Who were the winners and who were the losers? And the reason I'm doing that is because so much of what is happening in the GNU and which have been happening is actually related to this. And I'll explain. So, of course, obviously, the ANC was the biggest loser. They lost 71 seats out of the 400 total in Parliament. The Freedom Front Plus also lost 4 seats, and you might ask me, why am I even bringing that up? But you will see in a few minutes. Of course, the biggest losers were ultimately also the independents, because after all the drama with the additional ballot, the court cases, etc., not a single one made it into Parliament. It is also important to notice that even though the DA got more seats than they had previously in Parliament because of the proportional system, in real terms, they actually lost votes. So countrywide, they lost about 300,000, around that. And in the Western Cape, even, they lost just under 60,000 votes. And I'll explain now why that is important. The winners were, of course, the new parties. In the previous parliament, only 5 seats were occupied by new parties. In the current parliament, 79 seats occupied by those who were not there before the election. MKP being the biggest one, of course, 58 seats, and then the Patriotic Alliance, who has currently 9 seats. The rest of the 79 is sort of sprinkled around the other parties with 1 or 2, 3, 4, maybe 6 votes. It's very important to look at these maps because I think this summarizes the GNU for you, or what is the dynamic behind the GNU. These are maps that the IEC releases every year after the election. It shows the political parties and where they won in color. Left side of the screen, 2019's result, and then right side of the screen, the current situation that we face, so 2024's outcome. Let's just first look at what happened with the DA. The DA is represented in yellow, ANC's in green, and then purple is the Freedom Front Plus, dark purple, dark blue is the Patriotic Alliance, and I'll come to KwaZulu-Natal in a few minutes. So if you look at the yellow or the DA, what you can see from 2019 to 2024 is this wave that came in from the Western Cape that crept into the country a little bit. In particularly, when you then look at the purple spots, which is the Freedom Front Plus, you can see how the DA started to gobble them up. And I'll get back to that. The other interesting thing in terms of the DA situation is if you look at the 2024 map and you look at the dark blue, which is the Patriotic Alliance, they were, of course, not there in 2019, but in 2024, not massive, but significant support that they got. And of course, it's in the Northern Cape, the Western Cape, and then a tiny bit in the Eastern Cape, all in the rural areas. And this is, and I apologize for the racial references, but in South Africa, you cannot discuss electoral politics without looking at race. But in this case, with the Patriotic Alliance, they were, of course, unapologetically going for the rural colored vote. And that is what they got. Why is this significant? Because the Western Cape and Northern Cape, you cannot even dream about getting a majority there unless you have a significant support from the colored community. It's got to do with the numbers, of course, of the population. And we have seen the DA support under the colored community shrinking, primarily to the Patriotic Alliance, but also to other smaller sprinkle parties that represent the colored nationalism. And so this is very important to notice. Why is the Freedom Front Plus one important? Because the DA has recognized that they are going to struggle to get support from the townships or from the majority of Black Black support in this country. And so what they're going for is the low-hanging fruit. And therefore, they're going for the rural Afrikaans vote. The Freedom Front Plus, as very clearly illustrated there, you can see they don't actually do well on the coastal provinces. They do better in the internal parts of the country. And it's very clearly where there is more Afrikaans farmers and the more Afrikaans rural vote. And the DA, which explains, for example, why the DA was so keen to get the portfolio of agriculture. You know, there was a joke just after the election which said John Steenhuisen, and the only thing he knows about farming is that you buy rotisserie chickens at Woolies, which is maybe a bit unfair towards John. But the point being that this was not a natural portfolio for them. It would have been a much more natural one to put the Freedom Front leader in there. But they wanted this portfolio, and the reason being that they want to get that vote. They want to get the low-hanging fruits. The other big story, of course, then, which will also bring back to the GNU, is, of course, what happened in KwaZulu-Natal. If you look between 2019, look at the green, then look at 2024, no green left. And, of course, green is ANC. There's a tiny bit still there in the southern part of KwaZulu-Natal and a tiny little bit the northeast coast, but it's very, very little. And the light fleshy pink there that you can see, flesh color, is IFP. So what you can see is that MK in the dark pink just completely took over. IFP stayed roughly, they grew a little bit, and so on. And then you can see also, interestingly, about MK is, of course, that they basically only got support in KwaZulu-Natal, if you look countrywide, and a little bit of the southern part of Mpumalanga. And that is, of course, again, because they unapologetically went for the Zulu vote. But what you can see there is a very significant of the ANC's base, significant proportion of the ANC's base went. Do remember that between Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, those two provinces make up more than half of the voters' roll of the population, the voting population. So KwaZulu-Natal is very important for the ANC historically, but also in terms of voting numbers. So how does this play out then in terms of the GNU? The thing that you are seeing here is the battle for different constituencies. And this is what's been happening in the GNU. The media tends to focus on ideological differences. There is a bit of that. But largely what you're seeing is a fight for different constituencies. And this makes for a very fractious relationship between the two majority parties, or the two biggest parties in the GNU. In Ireland, for example, when they formed a coalition, and they even swapped halfway through the Taoiseach or the Prime Minister. But what they did is they took a long time before they formed their coalition government to agree on what would be the policy for the government. So no matter who was there, they would keep the same policy for the country and the government. We don't have that, obviously, in South Africa. But what you're therefore seeing is that on the one hand, the DA is pulling towards the Afrikaans community, the purple spots, and then that they want to retain the minority votes, i.e. they want to fight against the Patriotic Alliance, and they want to retain, and particularly the colored vote. And therefore, you see them doing funny things. They suddenly feel very strongly about Afrikaans and the Bellable, not a natural place for the DA to be. Agriculture, which we already spoke about, they are against the Bellable, they're against the NHI, they're against the Expropriation Act, again, very much farmers, and then, of course, the historical support within the NHI, white community that would not be very positive about the NHI. And then, of course, also, which was a very strange positioning that they suddenly took against VAT with the whole budget debacle. I think this caught the ANC very unaware, sort of by surprise, because this is not usually the space that the DA would occupy, to be against VAT increases. They would fight against corporate tax increases and so on, but it's not usually a thing that they would fight about. And that is, of course, because they suddenly wanted to drive this minority and narrative of the poor. The ANC, on the other hand, wants to get MK and EFF back and, of course, keep COSATU on side. Particularly MK and EFF, because if you count those two parties together, you get more than 64% again of support and of seats in the parliament. And so that's where they want to go. But in order to do that, they want to push social grants. They are for the NHI. They are for the Expropriation Act. In terms of VAT, how they were hoping to mitigate that was through a large list of exemptions, and then just generally, in terms of the developmental state. And you can see, therefore, why there are tensions within the GNU. So is it working? Well, I always say if it holds, it's working, and it is holding. But let me go into a little bit more detail about it. Of course, on the positive front, the ANC has been forced to be a bit more humble. They still tend to forget that they're not the only one in power, as we saw, of course, with the budget debacle. The DA, on the other hand, is finding their feet. It's taking them a little while, and particularly in some portfolios, they're doing really well. Home Affairs and Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries. I think those two portfolios stand out. Most probably the easier of the portfolios in terms of getting things done, because it wasn't, well, no, it was in a big mess, but you know, they are getting some stuff done there. They are, however, frustrated with their departments and maybe frustrated by their departments. I think one of the biggest damage or horrible things that Zuma did, or the biggest damage that he did to this country, was the fact that he destroyed our civil service to a large extent. And so most of the good civil servants left. There are some left, and there are some new ones coming in that are good. But you find that there's a lot of corruption and a lot of inefficiency, and then also unwillingness in some cases to work with the DA. The other issue that is frustrating to the DA, and which people don't always understand, is the fact that ministers can't just bring in new policies. So I think before the election, there was a lot of hope from DA supporters that the DA will come in and they will change this and they will do that and they'll bring in new and they'll scrap that. Not quite how it works. Ministers do have powers, but it's usually in terms of implementation. And then if there are enabling legislation that allows them to pass regulations, they can do so. But they can't just bring in a new policy. To do that, they have to take it through cabinet. And as the agreement in terms of the GNU stands, 60% of those in the cabinet needs to support that new policy change. So in effect, what that means is if they want something changed, the ANC has to agree to it. And so it's not as easy as just changing things. This is why, for example, why Schreiber is doing well in Home Affairs, because of course what he needs to do is change basically implementation. He needs to make that more efficient, and that he's been doing. And there are the other stuff he's been able to do through regulations. There's not major policy change that needs to happen in Home Affairs. And that's why he's not had such a lot of difficulty as, for example, when you're talking about education, communication, which has struggled, even public works, etc. The competition has been mostly good. There's been one or two little issues where maybe it wasn't good, between a fight between a minister and a deputy minister, but mostly I think it's woken up the ANC a lot very quickly after the GNU started. The ANC, there was a big debate in the NEC of the ANC about why the DA is getting so much more attention than they are from the media. And that's the kind of competition that you want. And so there's not this sort of laid back attitude. And most probably one could define it as a very intense arrogance that developed over the years from the ANC ministers. Yes, there are policy differences. We've spoken about that, and one can definitely include also some of the budgetary issues in foreign affairs. But are these threats? I don't believe that the ideological differences are the biggest threats. That is usually where the media focuses, like I've said before, but I don't believe that's the biggest problems. I think at that stage, when they get to ideological differences, they can usually smooth it out, as we've seen even now with the budget process, as long as Cyril Ramaphosa is there and a willingness to do that, and I think there is. Some people point to the provinces, and particularly Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, and say that that's going to be a threat for the GNU because in Gauteng's case, of course, Lesotho did not invite the DA into the GNU, or they couldn't get an agreement. And then, of course, on the KZN side, it's such a tight coalition, it hangs all on one seat. Again, I think those matters can be resolved and will be resolved. I think the biggest danger, and I've consistently maintained that, and that's every time where we get very close to the abyss, it lies in tone. I think the DA in particularly does not always understand how painful it is for the ANC and how infuriating when they point, and in the manner which they speak to them, which the ANC certainly sees as patronizing, and sometimes they feel that it borders on racism. And particularly Helen Zille, who's of course not part of the GNU at this stage, when she's outside, the tone that she uses, the dismissive tone that she speaks about ANC people, they find that very, very hard. And I think there's not always a very good understanding about how deep the the winds in our country go and how recent it is actually still, some of the hurt that so many of our senior cabinet ministers and senior ANC people have suffered. Helen Zille has now, of course, said that she wants to go for mayor in Johannesburg. It's an interesting thing that suddenly developed. She's not from Johannesburg, but if nothing else on a national level, I think it might be a good thing that it will keep her a bit more occupied in Johannesburg. And she might be not so much inclined to sometimes make very painful and damaging statements when it comes to the GNU. The DA, of course, often threatens to exit the GNU. I don't think that's wise. I think you can only call wolf or fire so many times and then people stop believing you. But of course, it does create wobbles in the market, and it does particularly concern foreign investors who don't understand always or don't have the time to deal with South African politics in such intricacies and details as we do back here. And in any case, I think once you look at the numbers, you know that is actually not really what's going on, because it is all in the numbers, really. You can talk ideology, you can talk tone, you can talk personalities, but ultimately it all is in the numbers. The magic number, of course, being 201, that you need to get a majority. And to pass in particularly the budget and money bills. You don't need 201 constitutionally to pass ordinary legislation, but of course you only need at that stage a majority of all of those in the House, present in the House, and you just need a quorum in the House. But of course it's dangerous, because if you don't have the support of the majority, you might suddenly find that the opposition gangs up and then you don't pass your legislation, and then you're in big trouble as the majority parties. So at the moment, as things stand, the total number in the GNU is 288. So those are all the parties that you see there on the circle. Without the DA, there's 201. So you would say, well, they have it, right? 201, that's what you need. Yeah, except that is too tight. There are often vacancies in Parliament, so you won't have the 201. People are sometimes late, people are sick. People get locked in the toilet. There's all kind of sabotage that can go on a tight vote. And as we saw, for example, with the first financial fiscal framework, somebody just gets locked outside the door because they're not on time to get back into the House. And then, of course, you can't pass it. Yes, they could try the smaller parties. ACDP has 3 votes, but the ACDP will never go with the ANC because of their position on Gaza. The NCC, unlikely to go with them at all. This BOSA and Action SA would most probably be open to some negotiations. So that gives you an additional 8 votes. But even that, when you get to 209, is very, very tight and most probably too risky. So what you are seeing here is really a marriage of inconvenience from both the ANC and the DA side. So the future for the GNU, as far as I'm concerned, is safe. I wasn't worried about it. I've never been worried about it since it was formed, in the sense that it will break down. I think it comes close at times, and that's usually around, like I said, tone. But for now, I think it is particularly safe. They do have the conflict resolution mechanism, which it's still not always working, but it's there. So in terms of ideological differences, that's where they go. And then when it gets to the more tricky things, as long as Cyril Ramaphosa is there, despite the pressure from Kusatu and the SACP, of course, who doesn't want the GNU, he is always been able so far, and that is his happy space, is to seem to smooth out these differences that occur. It's also important to note that the DA, of course, with all their bluster and fight from time to time around leaving the GNU, they are very aware of the fact that, of course, should they leave the GNU, it will impact on the markets. And then, of course, if the ANC is forced to go with either EFF or MK, which they won't do, but EFF possibly, that this would have a massive impact on the economy and our markets. And the DA will know that, A, their voters would punish them for that, and secondly, the business community, which largely, not exclusively, of course, but largely are the DA's bigger supporters, that they would certainly react very negatively. And every time we know, both in the forming of the GNU and even when there's been difficult times, the business community has played a key role in telling the DA to sort it out and to stay in there. So as far as I'm concerned, for now, the GNU is really safe and nothing's happening around it. The more dangerous or difficult time that will come is around 2027. And the biggest question is then what will happen at the ANC's elective conference, which will be held around the end of 2027. Firstly, the question, will Cyril Ramaphosa again stand as president of the ANC? He can stand as president of the ANC. He cannot take another term as president of the country, of course, but he can certainly stand as the president of the ANC. There's nothing prohibiting that. But my general feeling is he's done. My kids constantly say, when they watch him, they say that he looks like a guy who's over it. He looks a little bit better now than he did a year or so ago, or around Palapala's time. But I think he will most probably stand back. The question is then who comes in his place. Of course, the obvious candidate is Paul Mashatile, being deputy president. If it was to be held now, he would win. But we're still a couple of years out. And of course, there's a lot of people who are standing in the wings and who are interested. One of them being Panyaza Lesufi from Gauteng, always helps to be Premier of Gauteng. Ronald Lamola is definitely in the running, if not now, hopefully in the future. He is, as far as I can see, an excellent candidate. Of course, he stood in the last election. He is now our Minister of Foreign Affairs, but of course, have been our Minister of Justice. He is still a little bit young. If you speak to people in the ANC, they would say he's too young still. He must wait another 4 or 5 years. Then he will definitely be in the running. Certainly the business community overseas, and particularly those in London, who has heard him, and Paul Mashatile certainly favors Ronald Lamola. They really like him. So yeah, he would definitely be a candidate to watch, and definitely watch in future. Of course, Mpalula, being the Secretary General of the ANC, is very keen and also in there. Don't think at this stage it looks like he'll make it. And then an interesting name that has come up is Senator Mkhunu's name, the current Minister of Police. Apparently, rumor has it that the president favors him. It's rather irrelevant because the president won't indicate that publicly. But it would be an interesting candidate, one, because he's not been tainted so far by any corruption or by any problems around state capture. He is, of course, also from KwaZulu-Natal, and he is Zulu speaking. So it would be interesting. He's an interesting name. There has been some other names like Patrice Motsepe. There are some people looking at people outside of the sort of obvious names like Ramakgopa, the Minister of Electricity. I certainly don't think Patrice Motsepe is really in the running, but I think, some people are also looking at Frank Shikani. I think with any of those candidates, they will not be keen on getting into a bruising battle. So there would have to be a deal inside the ANC that nobody stands against them. And I doubt that Paul Mashatile will, for example, agree to that. So yes, I don't think, that's a very likely scenario. But 2 years is a long time. Like you said, Ilse Marie, in the beginning, a lot can happen in a very short time in politics. There's one point that also needs to be made, and that is that we might get in 2027 a scenario that the DA might start feeling that their opinion polls are not great, partly because they don't have the really sexy vote-pulling ministries. They haven't been able to deliver enough because of the problems they find in the departments. Of course, there is the global experience that the minority party in a coalition gets punished at the next election. This might be slightly different in the DA's case because their track record in the Western Cape and the fact that they've always said that their deal is with Cyril Ramaphosa, and if there is a new president, they might not like it. So they might feel, there's nothing that indicates that yet, that by 2027, they might want to withdraw from the GNU and rather run from an oppositional platform to distinguish themselves from failures of the government. So what happens then in 2027? Let's assume Cyril Ramaphosa is no longer president of the ANC. If he remains president of the country, which he can do, although the ANC has never been too keen on this, what they call the two centers of power, he can continue with or without the DA, of course. With the DA, nothing changes. Without the DA, he can also just continue because the big deal is actually getting the president. He can appoint other ministers just in the DA ministers' places. That's what would have happened or will happen if the DA just leaves now, either from other political parties or currently in the GNU or just with ANC candidates. And then he will just need to make sure that they have enough votes for the important votes in Parliament. However, if there's a new ANC president, you have to make a new deal, because if the ANC wants to have the president of the country, which they definitely would want to do, they would need to get the 201 votes for the election of the president. So they would either then have to make a new deal with the DA and or otherwise with any of the other remaining small parties so that they get the 201 votes. Or if they can't do that, so if the DA is out and they can't get it with the other parties enough, then of course we are back at the EFF and the MK scenario, which is not great. And we know that that would impact on our markets. Let me then just quickly turn to EFF and MK, because I do get a lot of questions on that. As far as MK is concerned, of course, complete organizational disarray, very little policy. This was a party that was created not because of pro certain things. It was because it was a revenge party against the ANC, and maybe not even as much against the ANC, but against Cyril Ramaphosa personally by Zuma. That's why he wanted to still stay a member of the ANC. The question is, of course, what happens and how much of if Zuma goes and how big a role is he in this whole scenario? Will he just stay as a Mugabe, for a long time, even not being that active at the moment, as we've seen over the last few days? Again, he's still very, very active in the party, very outspoken. He's supposedly ill. I mean, that's why he originally got out of jail. But clearly not too sick to still make babies, because he's recently had a baby again. So yes, I mean, I think that is one of the biggest questions remain, to what extent is MK just linked to Zuma? Floyd Shivambu was certainly a factor which had to be taken into account, because he's such a brilliant organizer, and he was supposed to then get the organizational structure back inside the in MK, but he's now gone. So that has left them. And of course, they do also have legal problems around various issues, but in particularly also around Zuma's daughter, Zuma certainly wants to take over MK, but she's in trouble because of her, she's being prosecuted for her involvement in the 2021 riots situation. The EFF, on the other hand, is also hurting, of course, not only because so many of their people and also voters went towards MK, and that's painful for them. And they've always had a weakness, and that is their over-reliance on Malema. You can see it in the opinion polls. You can just see that it's the support of EFF, of the support that EFF has is largely linked to the personality of Malema, and that weakens any political party. That's never a good idea. So the question is, if Malema at any stage leaves, or he's not as active or as he hasn't been lately, then what happens? They've also struggled to sort of figure out how to position themselves. Now, they were always the one in parliament who were the most radical. They were the ones who were thrown out. They were the ones who did all the shouting. Now MK is doing it more effectively than they are. MK's got the green uniforms. They've got the radar. So now they're trying to figure out how do they position themselves. And I don't think they have finally sorted that out, and they're struggling with that. So in conclusion, just on the GNU, I think what we have seen is that we have seen the best possible outcome for the country. I think this is what we needed. And I think it is largely working very well. It is a totally new ballgame. There will be ups and downs in this because of this fight for different constituencies. But I think because of the numbers game that they will keep it together. And the most dangerous time is going to be around 2027, or if at any stage Cyril Ramaphosa decides to go, but there seems to be absolutely no indication of that at the moment. Let me then just briefly talk about the geopolitical positioning of South Africa. It is, very difficult. One can do a whole presentation on this by itself because it takes there's a lot to say around here. So very briefly, look, what we have obviously seen globally, what we're seeing is a movement towards the right, which seems to have emboldened more and more xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. And it's very difficult for diplomats, and I can speak as a former diplomat, to understand how to engage with a world where the rules have really changed. Well, it seems there are no rules. And that's a very, very difficult thing if you remember that sort of modern diplomacy very much developed post the Second World War, and it was a way of trying to keep the world together and preventing the world from destroying itself. But these rules now don't seem to apply anymore. So diplomats around the world, and I speak to many of them, are struggling. They are bewildered. They don't know how to adjust to this new reality. Of course, when it comes also to South Africa, most of the focus goes towards the US and the US relationship either bilaterally with us or then the multilateral relationship that the USA has, because it can impact on us. I think, first of all, the biggest concerning thing is, of course, there seems to be a total lack of interest in Africa with the closing of the Bureau of African Affairs in Washington. Many of the American embassies have been closed in Africa. And then, of course, the travel ban and the proposed extension of the travel ban seems to be disproportionately affecting African countries. When it comes to South Africa directly, of course, there's the issue of tariffs. And then, of course, our aid, which has been cut dramatically. In terms of aid, our country will most probably largely be able to cope with most of the fallout there. But the sad thing, of course, is that given the restraints that we have on our spending already, if you spend money on that, there's no money to spend on something else. So it is very problematic. The tariffs, the government is still negotiating feverishly behind the scenes. They talk a positive game. Not so sure that it is that easy and that it will be that positive in the end, but they certainly still hope to talk around the tariffs and to find a new trade deal, even to bring some of AGOA back. Of course, America's conflict with China means that China wants new markets. China, of course, has for a long time been very interested in Africa and extending their foothold in Africa, and that, as far as we can see, will just pick up speed. And what it does from South Africa's side is, of course, South Africa will just move more and more towards BRICS, which is already something that was felt very strongly, but that they will focus more and more on BRICS. Interestingly, of course, in terms of our relationship with Russia, which was regarded as very negative under the Biden regime, that's not such a big problem now with Trump's positioning in terms of President Putin. And so the whole incredible conflict that was there in terms of between South Africa and America in terms of our positioning towards Ukraine, that at least seems to have calmed down a little bit. However, then there is the issue in the Middle East, and particularly Gaza. And of course, now we're going to see a lot of problems around Iran. But as far as it comes to Gaza, South Africa will not back off. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs said it in the last 24 hours as well. They will not back off around the court case, around Gaza, etc. So, and that, to the extent that that has played an impact in the South African-US relationships, I don't believe it's a defining factor at all, but it certainly is an additional factor that has annoyed, especially some of the policymakers in the US, that will continue to be a problem. Let me stop there, and then maybe we can engage a little bit through questions and answers.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, that was very insightful. And just want to go back to when you spoke about, how they lost constituents is playing such a big part of what the tension, what we're seeing playing out within the GNU. And to me, it almost then, paints a picture of the ANC finding itself between a rock and a hard place, right? Because it's almost in this vicious cycle by pandering to constituents that they've lost before, by and large due to, the economic failures, especially under the Zuma administration, and they're trying to get back at those, to try to get those constituents back by backing policies like expropriation, which we believe will just further hurt the economy. By doing so, they're in this vicious cycle without making the necessary decisions to actually make the right implications to policy to move this country forward. So I'm just wondering, by pandering to these policies that could cause further economic hardships, the ANC stands a very big chance of losing more support going into the next general elections. Do a new leader could breathe in some fresh life into the party, or do we just have to get used to this fractured political landscape that we're in now?
I was listening recently to, just over the last few days, I was listening to people who sent in voice notes and comments to talk radio about, and it was Johannesburg-based talk radio. So it was a big population, wasn't just the Western Cape, which you understand is a very critical against the ANC. But they were talking about the natural disasters that we've seen over the last few days and week. And particularly the impact that that's had on the poorer community. And the majority of them were African that phoned in and would have been, one would guess, ANC supporters in the past. And they were so critical. Look, irrationally critical and angry at the ANC. I mean, you can really not blame floods. I mean, you can blame it on climate change, but you cannot blame it directly on the ANC, that there are more floods and high winds and so on and so on. But of course, they feel that not enough was done in terms of building safe structures, not enough has been done. And even that, a lot of that is local government issues, about planning, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the places actually are not even ANC strongholds, like parts of KwaZulu-Natal, but certainly in the Eastern Cape where there was a lot of problems. And I have to say, if you take that and if you listen to that carefully, it doesn't paint a good picture for the ANC. And if I was certainly driving anything in the ANC, I would be very worried because I think you will see a continued decline of voter support. It's very difficult to look at by-elections. A lot of people try to do that. I have clients who follow that meticulously, but it's never very reliable because people vote very differently in South Africa in terms of local government and provincial and national, because it's a different electoral system. And secondly, it's a much more personal issue that comes in. Personalities are much more important at a local level. But having said that, I do think, that increasingly on a national level and provincial level, it's going to be a problem for the ANC. Look, I think things like expropriation, they shouldn't really be a reason why it damages the economy. It shouldn't really, because the way that the ANC intends to do it is the way that they've always done it. And that is to stay within the willer buying, willing seller model. And I've never heard once through this whole, what is it now? It started with the last ANC elective conference. That's when it really started heating up. So we're talking 4 years or so now. I've never heard anybody of any significance in the ANC suggesting that they will use expropriation in any other way. The only reason why the zero issue came in for them was in instances where either it's impossible to find a solution and the threat of it will push a solution. And then in cases like Johannesburg with the abandoned buildings, et cetera, and where there is so much owed to the council in any case in terms of levies and rates and so on, that in fact it should be a zero compensation. So there's no intention to change that. And maybe the communication, as often is the case, is very bad and was very bad. And I don't think they for a moment thought it was going to be a problem, and they should have known that it was going to be a problem. Of course, never anticipated what was going to happen in terms of the USA. But I think it shouldn't impact directly on the economy in terms of how they are going to implement it. The point is, though, that if we do not do something, you cannot be as where we are and still say that 60% or so of agricultural land is still not in the hands of those who are not white in this country. So there's a lot of threats that's going to happen. There's a lot of unrest potentially around the land issue because it is so emotional. So the ANC is desperate to just show that they are doing enough. They could have done more. They could have done it differently, et cetera, et cetera. But in terms of the intention, I don't think that there is a problem. Of course, you are making a more generalized point, but just because you brought expropriation in and because it is so sensitive, I think one needs to just remember that, and remember that there is absolutely no intention to go around and expropriate farmland without compensation. No. There's nothing like that. But is there an issue in terms of pushing things which is difficult for the economy to carry? Social grants? Yes, the DA would say reduce those, find something else of way of dealing with that. There's no way the ANC can do that. There's no way they can reduce social grants. And that is difficult to manage, NHI, they're not going to back off from the NHI. And yet there's no way that we can see how they will afford it. So yes, I mean, in general, your question is right.
Yeah. George?
Yeah, I mean, I've got so much to say on all of these topics. Insofar as the whole land thing, I mean, I take what Melanie says. We may not have a government at the moment that is hell bent on breaking property rights and etc. I'll accept that for now. I think the fear and the concern, and certainly what I've picked up from the people that I've presented to and the corporates that I've spoken to, is that they feel like we are loading a Pandora's box with tinder. And it might not be a problem for the time being. And I don't think the issue right now is that people are concerned about a Zim-style takeover of land in the near term. What they're worried about is what happens post-Ramaphosa. You mentioned Mashatile, but he's a compromised candidate. The people that I speak to, are not particularly comfortable with the Mashatile coming into power because of some of the corruption charges. So the minute you start talking about a compromised individual coming into power, questions always arise around, well, can they be trusted? They couldn't be trusted in a position of power originally. What makes them trustworthy now, especially with something as pivotal to any economy as property rights? And so there's the problem, is that the optics are awful. The communication, as you quite rightly put it, is even worse. The concern about whether it can be abused at some point in the future, I think, is valid. And so this is, I think, where the concerns around these sorts of policies arise. I can see you wanting to respond to that, so I'll give you a chance.
Can we just pause, with those two issues first, because they're both kind of difficult issues to address. Just remember, I hear you in terms of the land issue. And yes, and I think optics is often 90% of politics, and I think they failed in that. But if we actually talk, and this is what I regard my job is to just tell people where to get scared and what to worry about and what not to worry about. So in terms of the actual legislation that was passed, remember there is extensive protections about taking it to court. It's extensive. It's actually to the point where you go, oh my God, who wrote this legislation? Because they're bending backwards to keep on saying, if there is a problem, this can be taken. This can always be tested in the courts. And this is, of course, the difference between us and many other countries, is that ultimately we're a constitutional state. So yes, we can have leaders like Zuma who messes up, but ultimately the constitution is going to supersede this. The tinder in the box is exactly there when we don't speed up land reform fast enough. That's where the tinder of Zimbabwe was because so many years the Lancaster Agreement wasn't followed, wasn't abided by, and so many years after, you suddenly get one crazy leader, as you sort of hinting, well, I wouldn't put that on Paul. Paul wouldn't do something like that as far as I know. But, you could get a Malema type person saying the wrong thing at the wrong time, and you suddenly then get a problem. We haven't had it yet. But the point is, because the law is there, because the constitution is there, one would assume, irrespective of the political leaders, that you will actually, that would not. So in terms of the actual legislation that was passed, they needed somewhere, and remember, this was always in the constitution. This has been in the constitution since 1994, and nobody bothered about it, but it was there. All that they needed to bring in is to say there are times where we actually need to move away from market-related values, for example, in the city of Johannesburg. Look, could they have made it clearer? Yes. Maybe even in the legislation. And of course, the legislation is now being tested in the ConCourt, and I think that's an excellent thing to happen, also in terms of our American problem. Let it be tested. If the ConCourt finds that they need to make the regulations tighter or the legal issue tighter, good thing. Let them do that. And they will. They will. I mean, this is the great thing. Our leaders still abide by the courts, and they will continue to do it. Look, in terms of Paul, yes, there's always been rumors around Paul. People feel that he's compromised. People feel that he's living a very affluent lifestyle, and how is he managing to do that? We know that there's no questions about friends of his in the political domain who is funding former girlfriends. And one needs to ask, what is the payback around that? There's nothing illegal about that, but is there a payback somewhere around that? So yes. I mean, the interesting thing about Paul is that through all these years with our very rigorous and a really excellent investigative journalism, they've never been able to find something to stick on him. Now, he's either incredibly good at hiding, and I don't believe in South Africa you can do that with our media, or there is not enough there to really stick, So is he a little bit more radical than Ramaphosa? So less reconciliatory and kumbaya and wants to bring everybody in, for sure. Some people will argue that's what we need, because at the same time, people also criticize Ramaphosa for that, for being not decisive enough. Is he a little more radical? Yes. Is he closely aligned with the EFF? I think that gets exaggerated from everybody that I've spoken to who's close to Paul. They say that's exaggerated. Is he ideologically exactly where Ramaphosa is? It's probably not, but is he far away from Ramaphosa? Most probably not so much. And do remember that in the ANC, because of the way the system works, it's not that easy to just, as a leader, just do something, go on a tangent. You need to sort of get your whole NEC behind you, etc. But then I think the thing that we do need to recognize is that Paul's a very pragmatic politician. So hopefully and also somebody who understands the markets. He's not somebody who comes like Zuma did from a rural background with very little economic education. So he will understand that if you want the country to grow, if you do want your voters to keep getting social grants, you need money in the country. And if you're going to do things that are completely going to destroy the markets, that's not going to work for you and you'll fail as a leader. And therefore, I think in that sense, he is more pragmatic than some of the other guys that could potentially have much bigger problems behind them. That's not any of those that I mentioned, but some people that sometimes come up. Anyway, let's continue.
Yeah, no, just in response to your land reform comments, I remember sitting in a round table discussion at the Reserve Bank, and in that discussion, we were presented to by members of the or people within the Department of Agriculture, and they were going to set the record straight, etc., etc. And it came down to, I think it was clause 25 or I can't. Yeah,
might be 12, I think. Yeah.
Okay, I can't remember the exact clause that my memory escapes me. But what they did, the one comment that stuck in my head, was that they indicated that, in fact, the existing legislation didn't prevent what the ANC was talking about doing. All that it did, it went out of its way to make something explicit that previously had been implicit in the existing regulations. So the comment was, and there were many questions on that in that particular session about, well, then why has the ANC waited so long? Why hasn't it done anything up until this point, if it's such a burning issue? And if indeed so many people want to own land, then why wasn't something done previously? The other point to make is that I remember a study conducted by Frans Cronje, and he went into rural areas and conducted a study of a couple of thousand households, and he asked them quite specifically whether they would prefer to own a parcel of land, however big, I can't remember, or rather move closer to urban areas. And it was overwhelmingly moving closer to the city. So this idea that people will jump at the opportunity to go farming, I think is a fallacious one. It's not borne out in the sort of the studies and the numbers. So there's questions.
Actually, can I just say something on that point?
Just let me finish off by just saying there are questions about whether this issue is actually rather than borne out in reality.
So you're actually raising a point that the ANC will make, and I mean, I'm not an ANC spokesperson, but I'm trying to tell you what they are saying, is that their need for land is actually, and this whole debate is not actually about agricultural land. It is, in fact, about peri-urban land. So, for example, if you know Cape Town, around the airport, the townships, Nyangalanga, Khayelitsha, etc., which has been there for a very long time, a lot of that land actually belongs in private ownership still. In theory, they still belong to somebody. It's ridiculous. So part of the problem is that parts of it, they can't give people title deeds because so a lot of the problems actually around expropriation of land and about land reform has actually got to do with peri-urban land, not so much rural land. The whole rural agricultural debate comes up, but it's largely being driven actually by the Afrikaans communities. It's not actually coming so much from inside the ANC. And look, we can talk a whole day about this, so I don't want to take too long about this, but you are right that this wasn't a big issue and it wasn't going to be a big issue, but it all happened around, and this is why it became a political issue, around when Cyril Ramaphosa was elected at that Nasrec conference. And when they suddenly realized that those who were supporting Zuma, and it became clear that Cyril was going to win, they wanted to push through an expropriation issue, which would have been far more problematic. And they then agreed to look at it, etc., etc. So it was all a compromise there. That was then left. I mean, everybody forgot about it once that statement came through. Nobody was worried about what was agreed at the ANC level, etc., etc. They got rid of Zuma, didn't keep an eye on the EFF. And I don't know, Ilse Marie, if you were in Parliament that day, I was. And suddenly the EFF tabled a motion around expropriation. And they were then pushed into a corner by the EFF. So in fact, just to take you back about why did it happen suddenly, this wasn't actually something that came from the ANC. It came from a small faction within the ANC, many who eventually left towards the EFF, or is now in MK. And then the EFF, which saw cleverly from them, they're clever politicians in that way, saw a little gap and went for it. And again, the ANC played it badly, they communicated it badly, etc., etc. So it wasn't something inherently, of course, land expropriation is important to the ANC, land reform, not land expropriation, land reform. But it wasn't something that they were going to push. It wasn't number one on their agenda either. And then this sort of political issues around Cyril's election, Ramaphosa's election, plus the EFF that brought the debate into Parliament and nearly passed a motion, which, as I understand it, Ramaphosa's office intervened that day on and got the whips out of the Parliament, and they had to change it, amend the resolution at the last minute. So there's a very specific reason for it all. Doesn't change the point, of course, that people are jumpy about it, that America's jumpy about it, that the farmers are worried about it. And it is something that they will need to manage and especially communicate on better. I agree with you on that, definitely.
So, yeah, like you said, it was a political circus. But speaking of political circuses, we know that there's provincial elections, local elections next year coming up again. I was wondering, how much of what could happen at those elections could influence the GNU. We know that there could be jockeying, especially in the big metros where the ANC is kind of hanging at a balance here. Whether or not those jockeying for power at the local elections level could impact the GNU, or is it completely separate issues?
It's not completely separate, but I don't think it will directly impact on it, because so you do sometimes get cooperation agreements on a provincial level, which then filters down to a local level. Where the provincial ANC structures and DA structures or whatever structures agree that they will go into coalitions, etc., etc. So you could foresee that it's possible that they decide on a national level to say, look, we will what we will do is agree that wherever we can, we form a coalition on a local level. But which often happens is that you can't control your local councillors completely. They decide there's personal issues. I've had situations where in the past where I've heard that somebody says, we will not go into a coalition because you went out with my sister when we were at school and you didn't treat her well. Personal issues play a much bigger role at local government level, or the balance of powers look differently, etc., etc. Like we've seen, for example, in Johannesburg, the difficulties and suddenly, the whole issue around Al Jamaa and so on. So it depends very much local by local. So I don't foresee it playing a major role, and it certainly I don't think will impact on whether the GNU exists or not. I think what you might just see is, given the cooperation on a national level, that you might see that in some provinces, or even possibly national, but it's very tricky to do that you get an agreement about, where you'll form coalitions together.
Makes sense.
Can I end off with perhaps more of an international question, because maybe Melanie, you can shed some light onto this, because this is in my world something else that comes up repeatedly. Is what is the ANC's obsession with Gaza? Why does it have such close links to Iran? There's all sorts of rumors, and maybe you can dispel them or give credence to them, that Iran has assisted the ANC in funding it in some sort of way ahead of the elections, the head of the elections, and the payback was the court case, the genocide court case against Israel. And then further to that, we've obviously more recently had comments come out of the US indicating that they were going to look at investigating relations between some South African politicians and Iran. I can only assume that they'd be talking about people like perhaps a Naledi Pandor or somebody else for that matter. I'm not sure, but these are questions that come up. I obviously can't answer them because I don't know. But from you, it would hold a little more weight if you could shed some light on some of those. Yeah.
So the relationship with Gaza is a historical relationship, and understanding that the Palestinian question mirrors very much what ANC oppression was like, well, the oppression of the ANC and apartheid. So for the ANC, there's a very clear parallel, what the people of Palestine is going through or have been going through, and what the ANC and people of color, particularly Black South Africans, went through under apartheid. So there's an ideological empathy and understanding with one another there. That's the one thing. But secondly, there is also a very, very strong feeling from the ANC, and they knew this. Let me also say, and of course, there's an issue around Israel, and Israel's historically and under apartheid, who funded and weaponized the South African government, and the close relationship with Armscor at the time. And so, there's also a sort of a feeling around that in terms of Israel. But there is ultimately, if you speak to very senior people in foreign affairs, it is a moral question for them. It's a moral question that they could foresee what was going to happen the moment Israel started attacking Palestine. Of course, they criticized Hamas for what happened on October the 3rd. They could most probably do it a bit more passionately, but they certainly did, and they will continue to say that was not acceptable. But now what they're saying now is that they feel very, very strongly, and I don't think it's an obsession. I just think it's a very big moral issue for them, and they decided to take that forward and take it to the International Criminal Court, Court of Justice. So for them, it's a moral issue, it's a historical sympathy, and then also, a sort of deep suspicion sometimes about how Israel happened to work with the apartheid government in the past. I don't think there's a particular close relationship with Iran from this as a government. Is there a relationship possibly between individual ANC people? Yes, possibly. I don't know. I can't comment on that. Did Iran fund the ANC again? If they did, they were supposed to declare it under the electoral rules. The ANC tends to declare. There wouldn't really be a reason why not to declare it from their perspective. So I'd be surprised if there was. I know this is a narrative that Frans Cronje pushes quite hard. I certainly have not had anybody in the ANC saying to me that is the case, and I've asked. There was also a narrative that they paid, or that the trade-off was then the funding of that they would fund some of the legal issues, the legal costs around Gaza. Definitely, that I can categorically say is not the truth. That I know, and that I also know how the payments were made, and so it's not. That's just not true. And I think South Africa would have done it irrespective. There's no question that that Iran would use South Africa to do. I just don't think that is necessarily the case. The individual investigations, we know that there's a lot of there's been a lot of movements on Capitol on the Hill in America around, one, trying to put sanctions on individual ANC members, B, looking at investigating the relationship with Russia, C, investigating, obviously the issue around Gaza. We've known that there's been private member legislation that has been tabled. We don't believe that's going to go anywhere. I mean, I don't see that at all. And people that I speak to, legal people, say we don't believe that that's going to go anywhere. So, I mean, I think, that's also a political issues playing off in America that then translates into South Africa. I mean, ultimately, South Africa would also argue that they have the right to form bilateral relations with whoever they want as a democratic state. Is it always wise? Most probably not. But, I think ultimately, I don't see... I don't foresee that the whole investigations in America would have massive impact on the country as a whole. It might impact on individuals, but not on the government or the country as a whole.
Thank you. Ilse Marie, I'm not sure if you've got any other questions.
I think just, for a last question, I know this webinar is not supposed to go into international politics, but it's so big on the forefront at the moment. You in your ambassadorial experience, when you are faced with a situation like you do with a Trump administration who's kind of, dressed you down in front of the entire world, but there's also now this conflict zone. What would you suggest, how would South Africa position oneself in a situation like we're finding ourselves? Do we kind of remain on the back burner and keep quiet and hope, everything just kind of moves along and we don't get too injured in the crossfires? Or do we step, onto the forefront and make it known where we stand and how we feel and choose very strong alliances? Or is it a case of riding the fence and, getting the best deal for us going forward? I hope that makes sense.
It's probably a bit of everything. I think that's how diplomacy works. I mean, what we have seen, of course, is that it seems that the current American administration is very transactional. So I think that's the one important thing. You figure out what is it that we can give that they need, and you try and work around that. But the government would say up to the point where either it becomes directly in conflict with your own policy and what is needed inside the country. So, for example, if they put a pre-requirement that we get rid of the Expropriation Act, that's not going to happen, right? So, or if they say you cannot continue with the court case against Gaza, or you have to apologize for that, that's not going to happen. But also because the majority of people in this country will support the Gaza court case, so by far, if you look on the social media groups and so on, and then that ANC supporters, I mean. And so there are issues of principle which you cannot ask the government and where the government will not reverse. But I think, again, Ramaphosa, as he showed us in the White House, this is where he's a genius. He has shortcomings in other areas possibly, and was probably, people open for criticism on certain issues, but this is where he's good. This is where he's excellent, is to have the difficult conversations, to not get riled up, when he is faced with somebody who is clearly intent on making life difficult for him and maybe even insult him. He's had a long history in that, so he knows how to do that. So I have no questions that he could, and he would play a big role in that, is to build, as far as he possibly can, to build those relationships on a personal level, use his personality, use his charm, use his experience, to bring that back. I don't believe sitting back and doing nothing is the way to go. At first, I think many people thought if they can just forget about us, that would be great, as they did basically under Trump 1. Yeah, well, AfriForum kind of kicked that ball out of the court. So that's not, we're now on the radar screen. But there are many people on the radar screen. So it's a question of just positioning ourselves and understanding, as with diplomacy, how do you find that mutual sweet spot where both countries can get as much as they possibly can out of the relationship?
Last thoughts from you, George?
Yeah, last thoughts. I mean, there was something that Melanie said earlier in her presentation, and I don't know if she meant it in the way that I heard it, but she indicated that the ANC might like to reunify with the MK and EFF, or not in those words, but like in roundabout sort of way, she intimated that might be the case. And my question is, whether that's realistic, given the wide disparities of not just personality, but also the makeup of the policies of the ANC versus the likes of the EFF, for example, and MK. And then ultimately what happens when Zuma leaves, because he's old, another 3 years, 4 years down the line, is Zuma, is he still capable at that point in time to be able to be as active as he is at the moment? And, without the organizational assistance from a Floyd Shivambu, is MK actually something to be concerned about long term? Or is it, like you indicated, it was a protest vote, and it dies away at the next elections, especially if Zuma isn't there to kind of like fly the flag?
So let me just first say about and maybe I didn't phrase it quite correctly, what the ANC wants is, of course, to get the EFF, as many as they can, EFF voters and MKP voters back to them. I don't think they want to, I don't think there's any intention of trying to form a new party with all three, and there certainly is no idea of getting coalitions going with them. I mean, that would have been the easiest thing for them to do now with the budget as well. And you can see the resistance, I said that before the elections, that would be the last option for them. And it will only actually, if that ever happens, it's on the DA, because even as much as they disagree with the DA, as much as the tone of the DA irritates them and upsets them at times, they know that for the economy and the future of this country, it is far better to have a deal with the DA and those other minority parties than to have a deal with those parties formally. But what they would like is they'd like those voters to come back, because ultimately, the ANC didn't lose votes to the DA. They lost votes to two splinter parties from the ANC. And so what they would like, one slightly older, the EFF, but what they would like is those voters to come back. Will they get it? Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. And I mean, that brings us back to the question Ilse Marie asked right in the beginning about the ANC support, and will that keep on growing, or is that just failing naturally? Well, not naturally, but is continuously fading away because of the problems of inside the way the ANC is governing. And that's the big question. I was in KwaZulu-Natal just before the national election when it looked like MK, nobody was taking it too seriously yet. And I spoke in close to Durban and in Mklanga, and there was a break. Somebody else spoke after me, and I sort of sneaked out and I went to go and speak to the staff in the hotel. It's a very posh hotel, and I spoke to the catering staff. I always have to sort of explain my background so that they don't think I'm trying to spy or something. But once they trusted me, we started talking, and I was like, so how are you feeling about the ANC and MK? And what really struck me, and a lot of them eventually stood around me and we were chatting, not a single one said that they were going to vote for the ANC, not a single one. And they were very, very angry at the ANC. So then I knew that things were going to look very, very different, because if you get that kind of, and them understanding that I, in the past, even though I haven't been an ANC member for a very long time, were associated with the ANC, for them to then be that honest with me, I thought, like, we are in trouble. And that's the problem, is unless the ANC can do major changes in how they are being perceived, the question is, where will they go? And I agree with you that MK, for me, especially around the election, was very much a flash in the pan because it was so closely linked to Zuma. So MK, on the other hand, will have to get their organizational structures right. The question is how long their money will last, because we also, where is the money coming from? Because they clearly have money. And then the question around Zuma is a very valid question. And the question is, does he just become a little bit of a somebody who sits there in the background and sort of manipulates, a little bit like Mugabe did towards the end, and I mean, Mugabe left for a very long time, and still pulls strings and forms a sort of patriarch kind of position, and then, his wish was clearly to do that and let his daughter take over, but to what extent then, can she still take over? So to what extent we need to worry about MK? I think we need to worry about MK to the extent that the ANC is failing in terms of convincing voters to come back to them. So, and they're not really going EFF so much in that sense either. So the question is then, what happens? Do they just not vote, or do they just stay with MK because MK is the sort of other alternative? Or do we see yet again another party forming before the national elections? The problem is, from MK's perspective, the problem for them is that it's very hard in South Africa to form a new party and consist with it. We've seen it, and we've even now seen it in the EFF. If you think about COPE, if you think about Ahang, et cetera, they all came in with a bang. It's hard. It's a difficult electoral system, and it's difficult with the dominance of basically the 2 or 3 big parties. And what we've also seen is that our voter population still stays very much in the middle block. They're still fairly conservative. They're not going with the radical parties. But the one thing, having said that we do need to watch is, of course, the youth vote. The post-1990 crowd is becoming now really coming into play with elections. We know globally that young people only really get involved in politics by the age of 25. It's usually when they start working and pay taxes in other parts of the world. That's where they really get involved in politics. But in South Africa as well, we can now see that post-1990 group getting involved a lot more in politics. And of course, they are far more radical. We know that. We know that they are far more angry. We're far more demanding in terms of economic change. So that is something that is an unknown at this stage. To what extent, which way are they going to go? We know that in the past, the ANC had the above 30-year-olds solid basically on their side in terms of the black voter population. But when you get the under 30s, then it fragments a lot more into EFF, MK, and then smaller parties. So the big question is going to be the youth vote in future, not so much what happens with the traditional voters that has been there, for a long time, or the older voting population. And nobody's able to answer that question 100%, because we also don't know if they actually, up till now, the turnout's been very low from young voters as well. And so we just watch that.
Yeah, and still not a stronger showing from the DA ever. I mean, they just never seem to appeal to the masses.
No, and part of that is leadership issues, and particularly racial profile amongst the leadership. You're just not going to win in South Africa if your leadership looks the way the DA looks at the moment. You just know, no matter who they are.
Yes.
They're not going to make it. It's just not the game in South Africa. And you're not going to be able to appeal to radical young black voters if your profile looks the way it does between Helen Diller and John Steenhuisen. And now the DA, of course, have their elective conference next year. So it would be interesting to see what happens then. But, what we have seen now over the last, most probably two election cycles, is that strong black leaders in the DA just leave. They keep on leaving, for whatever reason, whether it is, and one can mention the names one after the other, they tend to leave. And so there's clearly an issue that hasn't been resolved inside the DA. And that will make it very difficult. And this is why, my whole presentation was about the fact that the DA largely is focusing on getting the conservative Afrikaans vote, and then retaining their white base, and then retaining the minority base. That's where their focus lies. Somebody like Moletsi Mbeki would argue the DA should just swing and actually just say they're a party for minorities and they fight for minority rights and give up on the idea of becoming the biggest party in the country. But I don't think they're there yet, so yeah.
That would be interesting, but there's still a lot of time before the next elections. You said the DA's elective conference is next year, right?
Yes.
So that's also going to be be interesting to watch and the impact thereof that it could have on the GNU going forward. But perhaps just on a closing note, and I know George, that you also share the sentiment. You mentioned, Melanie, in your presentation that there has been these headlines about the frictions within the GNU. For us, that's actually a good sign. It's a good sign because it says the GNU is working. You don't have one party steamrolling the others. Everyone has a voice. They have a voice to stand up. We have courts, like you pointed out, Melanie, also that, we can take and contest things, and there's some friction, but we're working it out to get the best possible outcome for South Africa. So for now, the GNU is holding, and there are these frictions, which so many say, shows cracks and is going to be the downfall, is actually perhaps a sign of the strength and how this unit is busy operating. But there's still a lot of weeks before we get to these elective conferences, before the elections. Who knows what's going to happen? I mean, both internationally and domestic, we're living in very interesting, very unprecedented times. So, hold on to your hats, because I think the playing field is open to many possibilities. But Melanie, thank you very much for your insights. I'm pretty sure we're going to chat again, perhaps from an international perspective next time, but I appreciate your time. George, thank you from your side, and we will chat again soon.